And we're very pleased today to have one of our favorite reviewers here. Jane was just here in December, and she's back with us again, and we're always excited when she comes. Jane's background is 24 years teaching English at San Antonio College. She also has spent many summers on stage with the First Presbyterian as the theater productions, and that was in the past years. She also loves to read, of course, and she says she's always very grateful to come here and to share with us. So I'm very happy to introduce this afternoon Jane Hansen, and Jane will be reviewing, of course, Hamilton's Affair. Jane.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I had a really good time with this novel. I think I read it 4 times. That kind of ease is not usual. Excuse me. So I would urge you to look at Elizabeth Cobbs just generally as a scholar and writer. I was telling a few of you earlier that her newest book is about World War I women in the Signal Corps, and it's called The Hello Girls. Excuse me. And so I really want to read that. So if you choose that one, let me know. It sounds very interesting, and it's been published by Harvard University Press. So Cobb is sort of going back to her scholarly roots, and Arcade is a fantastic publishing group, but that's pretty big stuff getting published by Harvard University Press. They don't do a lot of novels, as far as I understand it. Elizabeth Cobbs is a relatively extraordinary person. She has a PhD in American history from Stanford University. She's currently in the Melbourne Glasscock Chair at Texas A&M in College Station. She's an Alan Nevins Prize winner in historical research, and she's also been recognized for her literature. She's been a research fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution, a Fulbright Scholar in Ireland, a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and a member of the Historical Advisory Committee for the U.S. State Department. So her vita is pretty impressive. I really liked her website. You can go to elizabethcobb.com, and she has information about each of her novels, also the film that she produced and was shown on PBS called American Empire, which the theme is that since America has risen to the forefront in global relations, that we've served as an umpire in a world situation which used to be ruled by empire. Quite a fascinating study, and so hopefully maybe PBS will re-show that for us. And so a really interesting and witty person. What jumps out at me in this novel is her concern with humanness, and that extends all of the topics of the novel. And so she's looking at the way that human beings develop, and each of these characters is pretty rich. And since it's sort of a romance, it could get a little sweet, but it doesn't. And I think what she manages to do is look at these characters in a really deep way and convey them to us in a kind of expression that 21st century people can identify with. So that makes her, as far as I'm concerned, pretty fascinating writer, both a scholar and a storyteller, and that makes a really rich experience for the audience. And I would say, for those of us who've spent many years studying American history, you study 5th grade, 7th grade, 10th grade, and 2 semesters minimum in college. And that doesn't even begin to look at what you do in earlier grades relative to reading about the legends and myths of America. And so if we study American history that much, we begin to wonder, do we know it as well as we think we might? And so this sort of slice, this photograph of a particular couple and their time is really important. When we begin to study, we start with the earliest settlements and extend through the present, whatever that might be when we're students. This book begins with Alexander Hamilton in St. Croix and with Elizabeth Schuyler on the Hudson River growing up in a Dutch colonial family. At the time of the American Revolution, we're fascinated by Hamilton, not the least of it, Lin-Manuel Miranda's stage show and musical, but we're fascinated by these young leaders. Not all of the leaders of the American Revolution are august and experienced. Yes, Franklin is 70, but James Monroe is 18. The Marquis de Lafayette is 18. Aaron Burr is 20. Alexander Hamilton is 21. Madison, 25. John Marshall, 20. Nathan Hale, 21. And the elder group, Jefferson at 33, Adams at 40, George Washington at 45, and King George III, 38 years old. So this is a time when these movable forces are largely pushed forward by young people. And I think that's pretty fascinating. We might think that these individuals are much older and more experienced, but in fact, there's a few teenagers in there who leave a lasting legacy in our history. Cobb writes a story of lives, the characters' conflicts and contradictions set against the backdrop of opportunity, of potential for people, and the America of the New World, led forward by improbable heroes. And she touches on every uncomfortable theme possible. Slavery, dangers of war, hazards of temptation, faithlessness and infidelity, a plague of partisanship, and then there's courtship, marriage, and parenthood, all of which pose conflicts and contradictions to human beings every day. Perhaps she is comforting us somewhat, suggesting that the actions and audaciousness of those who step up and serve while reminding us of human frailty are really the heroes of all ages. And so she spins a yarn grounded in history, customs, social roles, and the fake news of the day. What if we might know of the motivations for such striving, tempered by human action, reaction, love and revolution, betrayal and redemption? And you don't get very far into the novel before you realize, I think, she's trying to teach us something, and definitely requiring our own reflection. Cutting back and forth between Alexander and Eliza's childhoods, Cobb sets each scene very well, but particularly provides episodes which foreshadow character behavior and practice later in their lives. Alexander later is the founder of the New York Manumission Society, a leader for whom lightning rod seems a good political description, and yet he is fatherless, orphaned, somewhat raised in the Caribbean on St. Croix, living amid stringent Danish royal council law regulating punishment for runaway slaves, and growing up poor. The boy frowned, pressed a folded handkerchief to his nose, and scanned the crowd for the third time. The noxious tang of the Spanish slaver that had sailed into port at daybreak was overpowering. Soldiers stationed themselves every few paces to oversee the offloading of Africans, but blacks still outnumbered whites 10-1. Women balancing baskets of green coconuts on their head wound through the press of laborers going about their usual work alongside the sparkling sea. The dock was crowded. And so this is the scene that opens in the novel, and we meet 11-year-old Alexander Hamilton, who doesn't seem to be able to fall in any sort of acceptable social role just because of the origins of his birth. Excuse me. And very quickly we meet 14-year-old Eliza, who grows up very, very differently in the lap of luxury in a Dutch colonial home on the Hudson River. And we find at 14, Angelica Schuyler, her older sister, was already a belle, a state which she had achieved by careful application to task. Precocious in learning and charm, she far preferred bustling Albany, a town of nearly 400 homes, to quiet Saratoga. Gentlemen who came to see her father there invariably took discreet notice of his elder daughter. Although not yet allowed to powder her hair, Angelica had coaxed Diana into giving her a bouffant halo that morning, silky ringlets cascading over her shoulders, framing her oval face. The housekeeper was normally too busy to fuss with such things, but Angelica was her favorite. She was most people's favorite. "I've no interest in impractical things," Eliza said, and turned her head toward the other direction to cool her cheek. It was almost a summer sun. When the troublesome creatures become a practical concern, I'll think more about them. It was an airy response, and she was pleased that it sounded sophisticated. Society ranked wit highly. Angelica usually got in the first thrust, but Eliza was learning to parry. She meant it too. Mama believed in selecting a husband was the most important choice in a girl's life. Angelica considered it the most fascinating. Not Eliza. To her, marriage was a faraway peak in the Catskills, lost in a dim haze. Eliza would study the route when required to make the journey. So she's not rushing into anything. Eliza's place in colonial culture afforded her experiences and unique interactions with people as well. Her father is increasingly well-placed to provide those kinds of experiences, somewhat like Emily Dickinson's experiences with the intelligentsia of her time. An imposing man pushed aside the blanket that cloaked the doorway of the meeting hall and walked out to greet them. He wore buckskin breeches and a red and black mantle draped over one bare shoulder. He gave her little more than a sideways glance. No one noticed a girl child. A younger Indian in European garments followed him. The chief gave a short speech in one of the languages of the Six Nations, though Eliza could hardly tell which. She felt fairly certain that one of the man's words was Schuyler, although it sounded like skicker in his unintelligible tongue. "Welcome to the home of the people," the younger man translated in the dignified cadence she associated with Indians, whose formal delegations often visited Saratoga. "The Onondaga are not yet present. The Iroquois League will gather when they arrive, but first, Schuyler must take meat with us this morning." Her brave papa had fought alongside the Mohawk before she was born, and together they defeated the treacherous French at Lake George. Schuyler is honored to share food and a pipe with our ancient friends. Papa spoke more slowly than usual and took a large package tied with a bright red ribbon from Prince. "I hope you will accept this unworthy gift from my fields. It is last summer's tobacco, dried and cured by my servants." The Indian leader, whose face was lined and grave, accepted the gift with a nod and another polite speech. Eliza wondered why her father spoke so diffidently. Silk ribbon came all the way from Manhattan, and they never had enough of it, not with 4 daughters in the house. And tobacco was currency as valuable as British pounds, which were rarer than roosters' eggs ever since trade between the colonies in Britain had stopped. And so every time that Cobb introduces another interaction between human beings, she also notes which part of our historical record it is linked to and what makes it unique. And so it looks like she's asking us to really think about all of these interactions and the way that we develop our shared humanity, and perhaps even how long it takes us to get there. Eliza is extraordinarily observant, and she seeks polite ways of handling discomfiture in many settings, in particular those where she's interacting with Native Americans. The appetizing smells of corn and venison reminded Eliza that she'd skipped breakfast. She'd never seen her father eat with his hands, but copied his gestures as he took the meal served on a pancake of purple maize. He ate as delicately as if dining on silver plate at the head of the table in Albany, enjoying a tureen of smoked grouse. Eliza munched through 3 delicious cakes before she struck grit in the ground corn. She winced and pushed the crumbled stone to the side of her mouth. How could she take it out politely? The men were engrossed in food and conversation, and her father was trying to explain the recent deaths in Boston, where British troops had fired upon a threatening crowd. Eliza contemplated keeping the grit in her cheek for the next few hours. She felt eyes on her. Across the room, an Indian youth of medium build sat cross-legged. Unlike many of the others, his sleek hair was tied back instead of shaved. He wore the feathers of a mohawk and gazed at her forthrightly. Eliza knew she ought to drop her eyes, but she returned his stare. His dark, almond-shaped eyes were neither friendly nor hostile, just intent and observant. Eliza wondered if they looked like her own. The young man took a small piece of bone from his mouth, still holding her gaze. He sucked the bone to remove the fat and then, reaching very deliberately, placed the refuse on the serving board in front of him. Eliza felt for the stone inside her own mouth, removed it with her fingers, and laid the grit on an empty platter. She glanced up and smiled, but the young man no longer met her eyes. Excuse me. Later in the same episode, she finds some help when a canoe catches her attention. The untethered canoe bobbed at the bank. A jabbering crowd milled about the pair, and a small boy took to splashing them, thinking it was all a game. As Eliza watched, the canoe slanted toward the powerful stream just beyond the reeds. She ran the last few yards to the water's edge, splashed into the shallows, and grabbed the dangling bowline with both hands, which caused the stern to angle closer than the fast current. The rope was thick and wet. The boat was covered in a sewn bark and heavier than it appeared. The water was faster. She felt her grip weakening. The canoe was getting away. A pair of hands clasped the line in front of hers, and a bare shoulder brushed against her. Suddenly, the craft was coming to shore. The long-haired Mohawk pulled with his strong brown arms. He gave her a smile and said something she didn't understand. The onlookers were laughing now, amused at her mad dash. What had she been thinking? Would Papa ever forgive her? And what must that boy think? Overcome, she pinned her attention to the hem of the shawl until the chief rose to his feet. With a stern but kind expression, he gave a short speech that the translator put into English for them. Now the chief looked straight at her, then her father, then back at Eliza. Schuyler, daughter, is brave and quick. She saved a canoe that took 2 warriors a week to build. She is not afraid men will laugh. I adopt her into this longhouse. Her name will be one of us. And historically speaking, we don't know why she was adopted into a tribal family, but she in fact is as a young person. And so that interaction of her father with local residents was really important. And for a time, there is good relationship and good parrying back and forth between the natives and the colonial activists. I think when we consider American history, our first sort of female hero is Pocahontas, and of course she is Native American. But there are these processes by which tribal groups adopt individuals in American history because they're brave or considerable in their own right, even in youth. And it's fascinating that Cobb focuses on one of these episodes to tell us a little bit more about Eliza Schuyler. If we just think about what we know from American history, sort of the usual social roles and appropriate manners of females during the time, we can see that she's really different. And part of that would be the influence of the outspoken Dutch family members. And so very straightforward conversation generally between family members in this book. I liked her mother's character very much, but because of time constraints, I'm not going to focus on a lot of individual characters beyond Hamilton and Eliza. But it shows us something of the backbone of that family and how the mom's influence is really important for the children, and the way that the family treats females in this time is the way that the boys of the family will go on to treat females in their own worlds as they get older. It's really fascinating as well to read through the novel, and you're thinking about King's College, and you have to remember that that's the Princeton uprising, and that even our universities were revolutionary in breaking away from the status quo of the time. So you're reading a novel about quite extraordinary people, quite extraordinary circumstances, and yet Cobb brings you back to these two individuals time and time again to show you the content of their character. And none of it's easy what these two go through. Is he a deliberate cad? No. But I think those things that make us empathize with other people or sympathize with other people, for many of us, when folks push those buttons sort of in the right order, we react very generously, and that's how it begins for him. In the meantime, he is trying to endure illness and his mother's death in a culture in the Caribbean where illegitimate children, unmarried women are not well considered. Hamilton's mother ends up in prison because she dares to go to court to separate herself from a man who beats her. And so you want to think about these conflicts that human beings go through. They've changed, but we still go through them, and our culture still struggles with them. And it's interesting, I think one of the other things Cobb is trying to do, especially with the partisan politics, is to show us that this has always existed. This is really nothing new. It's perhaps that the language goes farther. I think we are no less dismayed by those kinds of behaviors. And we wonder, what are the causes of those things when we know that there are better life plans that we can follow? And so as Hamilton tries to endure his illness, he finds himself cared for by a physician and his mother's slave and another slave servant from a neighbor who prior to this time had very little to do with the family because of their situation with illegitimacy. And so Hamilton, very young, watches as his mother dies. And there's very little he can do about it, and he doesn't quite know where his life will lead him. Even in his delirium, Alexander knew the ague must be bad if the adults banned James from the sick room, and Anna Lindstrom MacDonald had lifted a finger to help Rachel Lavienne and her illegitimate child. She should put a red lamp in that window, Mrs. MacDonald had said to Mrs. Helmetson one Sunday when the family walked into church. St. John welcomed sinners like Rachel Lavienne, and though it would not baptize or school her bastards, Mama led them to their regular pew, head high. But when they sat down, she leaned in Alexander's direction. The curl on her forehead fell sideways, and Alexander noticed again, as he had before, the white scar left by Johann Lavienne. Never look back, she whispered, the only allusion she ever made to the decision to abandon her first husband and their infant, for which the court had jailed Mama and forbidden her to remarry. You'll trip over what's next. The bed shook. Alexander's lids were too heavy to open, but he felt the mattress rock on his ropes. Something was amiss. Sleep tight, Mama had said when she winched the cords tight at night. But he didn't open his eyes. Nothing bad could happen. He and Mama would be well soon. Poor lass, Mrs. MacDonald said in a soft voice he didn't know she had. A chill raced up Alexander's torso. He knew he must lie still so as not to rouse Mama, but his legs and arms trembled violently. The breeze turned icy. Alexander felt his mind slipping. Alexander's left shoe had gone missing in the inventory when he was still delirious, and he couldn't wear just one to court. The store and its goods, the slaves, the furniture, the crockery, Mama's skirts and blouses, even the milk goat in the courtyard, all had been seized. Ajax was gone without a goodbye. The officers of the probate court pounced on Rachel Lavian's goods as if her sons were thieves who might steal them given a chance. James and Alexander Hamilton were spared their clothes, but the rest of their life had vanished as abruptly as if a hurricane swept their house out to sea. Where would he get another pair? What kind of work could he get without shoes? How would he eat? If Alexander had been wearing his old pair in bed or tucked one under each arm, they would not have been lost. It was a foolish thought, and the hand-me-downs hadn't fit well, but he wished he'd had them now. Mama would never have sent him out barefoot in public before, shamed in front of the town. Only a few days later, he'd planned to stuff cotton in the toes to make them fit more snugly, but kept forgetting. He would never see her again, or Ajax. His childhood friend had been led away in chains. And where would he and James go? They were alone and penniless in a world that had despised them. Some people were born bastards, others slaves. That's the way it was. The tears came at last, and Alexander was glad for the veil that covered his face, so no one could see. So, contrary to that sort of heroic stance that Hamilton has today in American history, and certainly revived by the stage play, he has a pretty rough childhood. And, amid all of the history that Cobb reflects for us, she can't really explain away these kinds of perspectives from the law, the government, and from other human beings in the culture. And yet she continues to share Eliza's thoughts, especially her sort of modern notions about relationships, building a character the reader admires, but at the same time sort of emphasizing what Alexander doesn't have and what Elizabeth does have. Eliza looked over at her sister, lost again in the newspaper. The cat was hiding under Angelica's chair. Her sisters seemed to share a special bond with their father. Angelica has a masculine mind, their uncle once said. Eliza hadn't known if he was pleased or shocked. Some considered curiosity the worst of women's vices, and Reverend Hoydle frequently criticized Eve's unseemly plucking of the apple of knowledge. But Papa seemed to enjoy Angelica's inquisitive turn of mind. Perhaps other men admired that in a woman despite what they said. What do you think, Angelica? Shall we separate from England? It was the first time a word of outright rebellion had crossed Eliza's lips, and she felt at once an unexpected thrill of adventure about politics for once, and started to care about the world outside Saratoga. Angelica paused. I don't know the answer. What I do know is the Sons of Liberty are serious, and England has defeated every enemy since the Spanish Armada. They'll crush the insurrection if it turns violent. I fear for our men. I hope they won't be pushed into it. The Patriots pray to George III, Angelica said as she placed her paper on the table and stood up. But if you can sway God the Father, I'm sure they'd be grateful. Her sister smoothed the front of her gown and left the room. Eliza looked down. It seemed less of the boot in front of her seemed less of an accomplishment than before. Why didn't she grasp intrigue as readily as Angelica? She would never be as smart. She put aside her knitting. Something else troubled Eliza now that she was alone. The night seemed darker and the freeze outside more menacing. Angelica said Papa might fight, but not which side he would take. Philip Schuyler loved his red uniform. Could he really turn his back on King George? Wouldn't that be treason? They hanged men for treason. So as you can see, the novelist is really working at keeping the awarenesses of the time in front of the reader. And it works to great effect. And while this is a romantic application, we have female characters who really think. Even Angelica, the sister who likes being very girly and dressing up and having all kinds of fashionable gowns, is a real thinker. And what must that have been like in a time where we almost always believe that women are very quiet, except for, Abigail Adams. And so what Cobb's telling us is that women aren't quiet at all. Maybe we're just noisy in our households, or noisy in our families, or noisy in our social venues. But those points are always well made. Alexander Hamilton, in the meantime, finds small good fortune in working with a cousin who has as many financial problems as he does, and finds his way off the island and away into better society, as well as an opportunity to go to King's College amid the simmering of revolutionary thought in America. In their cramped quarters, Alexander and roommate Robert Troopes started a debating society that included Nettie Stevens from Christiansted, finishing up his medical studies at King's. At first, Alexander had been reluctant to condone protesters bent on destroying other people's property. He knew how hard it was to sustain a business. He'd never forget what Mama had said, "If a thief steals one ribbon, we must sell 20 to make up the loss." Yet he gradually came to see the colony's struggle as one for justice, and justice was the breath of life. The British Constitution was a marvel of fairness, Alexander said to the circle of young men whose heads increasingly turned in his direction. But it had little meaning if Parliament refused to apply the law in America. Robert Troop, a native New Yorker who understood local resentments in his bones, insisted not long afterward that Alexander address a mass assembly of tradesmen gathered on the Commons to support the rebellious Bostonians. Truth was universal, Alexander realized, and as valid in Christiansted as in all Christendom. And so he began to speak, and once he did, the words poured forth. They were born free, he told them. They were as worthy as men anywhere. They deserved respect, not abuse. Parliament acted as if it had the power of the Grand Mogul, but it didn't. If the people of New York had no voice in the law, it wasn't their law. Alexander felt he knew every face, and each was a brother. They were men of dignity despite misfortune, ready to stand up for what was right. New Yorkers must unite with Bostonians, Alexander told the crowd. They must hold firm, or power and oppression shall triumph over right, justice, happiness, and freedom. The crowd whistled and yelled and clapped until Alexander's ears rang. When he jumped down, he was also overwhelmed that he scarcely recalled a word that he had said. After a childhood of illegitimacy in which law trampled the voiceless, and he had been unable to protect even his mother, he found he could defend the honor of men and women everywhere. It was transforming, redeeming. Alexander's career as a propagandist might have ended there, though, consumed as he was with classes, and had an anonymous Tory pamphleteer not denounced the Patriots as a venomous brood of scorpions a few months later. Cutting off trade with England lined the pockets of greedy merchants who hiked prices on scarce goods, the man wrote. Farmers couldn't buy simple things they needed from abroad. The boys of the King's College Debating Society waited for a rapier rejoinder by someone of property and standing, but the outrageous accusations went unanswered. Alexander studied the lengthy pamphlet with data he found at the college library, but his favorite phrases required no research. The sacred rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or rusty records. They are written as with a sunbeam in the whole volume of human nature by the hand of divinity itself, and can never be erased. Alexander hadn't signed his name as was customary in politics, but friends again spread word that a young King's College student had authored the pamphlet. Poppycock, one professor had said when Robert Troup hinted that the charity student Alexander Hamilton was behind the widely admired piece. But the literary effort played havoc with Alexander's exams and the study of medicine. Worse, he wasn't sure what unpredictable forces he'd helped unleash. And so things get stickier and stickier for Alexander Hamilton, but he is also widely appealing. And he finds himself in the middle of a New York regiment, and eventually is called upon by General Washington to join the regular army. And so they merge. At the same time, the book reveals this to us. We also find out that Alexander Hamilton is a magnet, apparently, for beautiful women. And, you know, he's rubbing elbows with the great and near great. So going to a soiree at George and Martha Washington's must have been some big deal. I remember going to Mount Vernon and going inside the house and just being nonplussed by the idea that the paint in their dining room was a very intense shade of teal. And I just didn't think that those kinds of colors with that intensity were really part of all of that. More pink and pale blue and cream, but no, vibrant, glowing teal. Really pretty, but super modern, and not really something that we think about when we think about the history of these individuals. At the last soiree, Martha Washington had arranged to keep their spirits up right before Congress evacuated Philadelphia, which now seemed years earlier. It was only a few months ago that Alexander had danced away the night with pretty Kitty Livingston and half a dozen other young women. Willowy Martha Bland, with her dashing repartee and revealing décolletage, had kissed his cheek when she tucked a posy in his buttonhole. The belles who attended dances to sustain officers' morale appeared besotted with Alexander's West Indian charms. He did his best to win them over, and usually succeeded. Being Washington's aide-de-camp had vaulted him into the social stratosphere, though staying aloft was contingent upon discretion about his past. I do take care, Ham. I button my trousers and pick tobacco from my beard. So why do I feel defeated if you're here? Being tall, dark, and handsome ought to count for something against a Caribbean runt. Ah, but a woman must be wooed step by step. Miss one, and she thinks twice, Alexander said. Her hair, her smile, her wit, if she has any, must all be given full due. To Venus, praise is more alluring than gold, more intoxicating than brandy. The American Czar, mon frère, Lafayette asked in Alexander's direction, gauche? They are too slow. A man must let a woman know tout de suite that she is a goddess, that her skin is like buttercream, her hair like silk, her breasts like bonbons. In France we do this, and on Saint Croix, no? Oui, bien sûr. I think of every woman as my mistress or lover when I speak with her, Alexander said. Well, you better keep your mitts off at least one young lady when you get to Albany, Tench Tillman said. I have first claim to General Schuyler's daughter, the one I met during the Iroquois conclave, so don't go making eyes, Ham. The rest of us need wives, too, if we're going to populate the hinterlands. So it's pretty good-natured banter, but apparently Alexander Hamilton has the key to garnering a young lady's attention. And enough that his friends don't like the competition. Hamilton also finds himself wanting to meet Schuyler's family. He's intrigued by the general, and eventually that is, in fact, how he meets Eliza through her father's involvement in the Revolution. And Hamilton is very interested. His gaze felt as intimate as a hand upon her shoulder. She reached for her wine goblet. The spacious room seemed smaller than usual. Miss Schuyler, your father tells me that your family recently hosted the British Officer Corps. That was noble of you. Eliza made herself look at him. Although Hamilton's coat was cut from an excellent fabric, it was faded, as if washed too many times. Officers purchased their own uniforms, and many dressed resplendently. Eliza wondered if he was redirecting conversation on purpose. Perhaps it came from modest circumstances. I would like to think the British might do the same for us if the tables were turned, she said, but their needless destruction of Saratoga makes it so difficult. She flushed. She wished she'd held her tongue. Hamilton smiles. Only a fool marches into a family dispute, General Schuyler, but if forced to make an alliance, I must side with your daughter. I also can't imagine you turning innocent civilians out of their home. I hope you're right, Colonel Hamilton, Papa said, but war takes men down roads they never imagined. Hamilton nodded and returned his attention to his plate with the dispatch of a soldier under orders to proceed to the next assignment. Eliza took a sip of wine. Her throat had gone dry. She ought to have paid closer attention to Angelica's lectures about conversation. Her sister would always have an amusing story to tell. I'm afraid we weren't quite the perfect hosts to our British guests, she said, though we did try. Of course, it's unfortunate now that you have to leave so soon. Can't you stay for a cup of tea? Your father will attest that my business is urgent. Well, I wouldn't want you to neglect your orders, Colonel Hamilton, Eliza said as the young man pushed back his chair. Her father rose to show their guest to the door where the two men spoke for such a long time that an icy blast followed Papa back into the room when he returned to the table. I read Hamilton's pamphlets at the start of the war and heard of his coolness under fire, he said, but I had no idea what a thoroughly fine officer he is. His grasp of matters military is remarkable in one so young, and he's got strength of character. I see why Washington sent him. Gates will hold on to his troops like a boa constrictor, but Hamilton will fight like a tiger. Eliza took a deep breath. And that was simply awful because for the first time, she might have met a man who, for no good reason beyond his daring words and devastating eyes, she simply couldn't live without. So the romance factor is in there, but it's a sort of a practical romance. And I can't imagine courting in the middle of the Revolutionary War. And how difficult that must have been, worrying if your father were taken that he would be hanged for treason under British law, of the instability of war generally, of the fascination that she has developed for Alexander Hamilton. Nonetheless, they managed to proceed through the war, and by February 1780, the two are courting, and in December, they marry. Eliza's parents had given their approval without hesitation and come to Alexander as a son, and come to view Alexander as a son in the 8 months since their engagement. Eliza knew Alexander had revealed all when he asked for her hand, because Papa later told her he had consented because he felt he had read Alexander's soul. Papa recognized the blind injustice of birthright. When young, he had divided his inheritance with his younger brother and sister, not entitled to a penny under the laws of primogeniture. Eliza knew Mama was asking something different. Was her daughter ready for the hardships as well as joys of marriage? The stranger who rested under Mama's palm, who might die stillborn or kill her, bore witness. The bed made it real. Eliza would lie in it with a man, her husband. Eliza reassured her mother she was ready, though of course she wasn't. The celebration had gone forward at the appointed hour in the blue parlor. Schuylers, Van Rensselaers, Van Cortlandt cousins crowded together, jabbering in Dutch and English. Relatives flocked from both sides of the river despite the dusting of snow before dawn. And sleighs filled the avenue in front of Albany's stateliest manor. Everyone was too polite to notice the groom had no family other than his military family of John Lorenz and the Marquis de Lafayette. That must have been an amazing party in the middle of privation, and it also gives you a taste that being well set in the social standing might be a little bit helpful during those kinds of conflicts, especially with war in our very backyard, so to speak. Alexander Hamilton witnesses the British surrender at Yorktown in 1781, and the Hamilton family grows while the Federalist Papers and service of the nation as the first Secretary of the Treasury develops his professional vita. Withstanding politics, enemies, frenemies, and friends, Alexander Hamilton is largely successful until confronted with a circumstance not unlike his mother's, whose imprisonment for leaving an abusive partner is unconscionable to the young Hamilton. It is this episode which complicates Hamilton's personal and public life. Alexander saw only a silhouette at first. "Good afternoon, madam. How may I help you?" The woman rose and dropped into a deep curtsy. "Colonel Hamilton, Mr. Treasury Secretary, To Alexander's dismay, she unexpectedly burst into tears. He handed her a handkerchief from his breast pocket. "Please, madam." As the lady dabbed her eyes, Alexander examined her more closely. She appeared in her 20s. Black hair was swept to a French pompadour from which long curls fell over one shoulder. She had vivid blue eyes, wide cheekbones, and a petite nose turned up at the tip. A small chin gave her face the shape of a heart. She seemed familiar. He noticed a split in her lower lip. It came to him. The woman across the street a few weeks earlier. That explained the tears. "How may I help, madam? I'm sure everything can be put to right. Tell me what you need." And so Cobb goes on to describe human conflicts which arise in times lacking antibiotics, equality, a climate with no less gossip than our current climate, no less manipulated language than our current climate. And she shows us that empathy may sometimes be used as a weapon against an individual, that it is considered a weakness, especially for those who are ruled by guile or an absence of ethical deportment. And this features strongly in the Hamilton affair. Blackmail on top of infidelity complicates his life even more. And his acceptance for responsibility in office weighs heavily on him. He feels it is his obligation to do right by the people of this developing country. Long-standing political jealousies continue to fester and grow, and the reader's unrest, also tells us that we're anticipating what Cobb is going to tell us next, and so perhaps a little bit of an increase in anxiety about Eliza, who remains steadfast in her marriage. We don't understand why she does, but there are several messages in the text that remind us of better ideas, better writing than the complications of yellow journalism. Cobb talks about the sermons of John Knox in relation to Hamilton and how they provide him a great deal of comfort. And rather than to spread out the affair in front of you, I'm going to make you read this book yet. It's a terribly difficult circumstance for both of them. Why doesn't he stop? I can't tell you. Elizabeth Cobb can't really tell you. Why doesn't Eliza leave? Well, she's tough, but she also truly loves her husband and is nonetheless mortified. Cobb never tells you as a reader how to feel, but she keeps putting these episodes in front of you for a variety of reasons, certainly to flesh out the story, but also perhaps to engage your empathy. That sometimes the very best of us, just like the very least of us, have the same complications in life, and that being human requires some understanding of other human beings. And facing life's challenges with thoughtful reflection as well as action and forgiveness is really imperative. And so Cobb opens the rest of the story for us in that way, with increasing tension with Aaron Burr, with partisan politics, with blackmailers complicating situations even farther. And Hamilton dies as a result of a duel with Aaron Burr, as you all know. And Eliza outlives that code of behavior by some 50 years. And she does some very extraordinary things. And I'm not using very to hyperbolize, but to say that she founds an orphanage. She raises another 150 children as service through the orphanage. She feels it's imperative to provide kids who don't have a good home and good parents with a good experience to set them on their road. And Cobb is really interesting. There's an epigraph at the beginning of nearly every chapter, and I found these so interesting. Toward the end of the book, she quotes Mary Wollstonecraft, and Wollstonecraft was Mary Shelley's mom, and she is the author of The Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is really the very first feminist tract, which calls upon all humanity to recognize that women have brains, capabilities that were underdeveloped and unconsidered at the time. And so Cobb quotes from a letter from Wollstonecraft in the final chapter of the book. It appears to me impossible that I should cease to exist, or that this active, restless spirit, equally alive to joy and sorrow, should only be organized dust, ready to fly abroad the moment the spring snaps or the spark goes out which kept it together. Surely something resides in this heart that is not perishable, and life is more than a dream. And so, in reflecting on Eliza's life, the opening of the New York Orphanage Asylum in 1806, the things that she manages to accomplish, and Burr's reminder through Wollstonecraft that each of us has a contribution, and we find it difficult to think about that time when we won't be here. What might we leave behind us indeed? And in this story, what Cobb has done is to show us that our heroes, our improbable heroes, are human beings just like us. And they face all of the conflicts and contradictions we do. The excitement of building a family, of having children, the complications and worries of difficult childbirths, of complicated relationships, of distance that we may not understand completely today. We don't think it's very far from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C., but in these times, it's very, very distant, really. So you want to think about how in 1915, as an example, it would take 5 hours in a buckboard with a horse to get from Stonewall to Fredericksburg. 5 hours. That's just 15 miles, y'all. And when you're on that road today, what is it? 4 minutes? Pretty quick. So, yes, these are very different people, but they are very much like us. And what Cobb manages to do is use the themes of our history, of all of our conflicts and contradictions, the complications of human life, to retell the story of very brave, successful lives as a way of suggesting to us that, like Atlas, we all have to bear the world on our shoulders. And it's uncomfortable and it's challenging. And those people who choose to do it for whatever reason, at the time they're not sure that they're saving anyone, and yet they leave us a legacy to consider. And I believe that that's really Cobb's vocation, to ask us to consider what really happens in American history versus just vignettes that we get in those classes that we go to. And I think what we learn here is that endurance is definitely part of the game, but also having the confidence to remain strong in your character, to not waver in that kind of belief and faith that you hold inside, is also imperative to success. So I'm not going to tell you the rest of the story because you really know it all. Do you all have any questions?
I'd like to ask a question about the war itself. I was really surprised at how she represented it with such civility. Did you notice that there wasn't a great deal of animosity between the Patriots and the English?
You know, the code of honor is something that we have shared with our British cousins. And that comes to us, I think one of the first places we see that is actually in Beowulf. How one group of the family might be distant, but when there's a need, you come and help, and you step up time and time again, despite age, despite the monsters that come for you. And it does seem very like there's a lot of deportment, lots of fancy Age of Enlightenment behavior. And yet, at the same time, all those patriots that are practicing guerrilla warfare. So there is a structure. It is fascinating. She does a beautiful job. And as a historian, I would say 25 or 30 years ago, a historian would not write a novel like this because it's not history, but I use the term docuhistorama because there's so many strands of human life and behavior in it. Today, it's a great way to deliver history and to get people interested in individuals. And, or going back to all the outside allusions, John Knox's sermons, reading the tracts that Hamilton wrote. As a college student, I was just drawn back to those references, and, I needed to remind myself what that content was about. And, it's pretty interesting, no taxation without representation. There's probably plenty of us who could suggest there's some of that going on today as well. But the civility, that's a big difference. I'm not.
Really beautifully done in the book.
Yeah. The levels of deportment, but even Aaron Burr, he's civil, but you still want to, I didn't like him very much, but never have. He just seems to be the king of contrary. But isn't that life? Don't you know somebody just like that? Good question. Anybody else? Well, I loved reading this book 4 reads in the 7 months that I had the book. That's pretty good. And I reread a lot of things, but generally I just read the novel a couple of times. I just kept going back to this, asking myself, why do I like this book so much? Because, it's a little bit like a bodice ripper, but so much more. And you get a wonderful internal female dialogue that you don't get in a lot of other places. And I think it's partly because Cobb is a scholar and she's a female, right? She's not going to misrepresent all of us. She wants us to sort of enter in. It's like any story that has a character that's not named. I always say that writer wants you to step in. Where can you be at the table during that banquet? And that's definitely what Cobb is doing. But every scenario, you can find yourself fuming or worrying or, I'm thinking like her mom right now. And, you just kind of find ways to identify. And then there's very poignant scenes, even in the very brief interactions between Hamilton and his mother. I think she's a really well-rounded writer, and if you look at her website, you'll be super impressed. Her screenwriting capabilities, her concerns about what's going on in United States culture today. This is a pretty well-informed person, and these are awards, the awards that I talked about, these are not won just because you show up. You've got to be really, it's not so long that these historical awards only went to men because it was considered, the greater scholarship. But since the 80s, we've had really fantastic female scholarship, and it's been published despite the gender identity of the individual, just because it's such fabulous work. And for a very long time, women were not considered to be able to generate that kind of work. When you look at what she writes about and how women turn the culture and perhaps turn the tides of war, it's a pretty validating experience to read about women who, while they may have been dismissed by some people, are not completely dismissible. And so, that World War I generation fascinates me. I want to read that. My grandmother was one of those World War I women, and unheard of. She had one child. She owned real estate. She was a nutritionist. She ran a school cafeteria. And I think, Cobb is drawn to characters like that in her history. And so as she unfolds it for us, it's worth reading. It's worth spending time with. But she's also really a pleasant person, so maybe we should all go to A&M and see if we can get an appointment. Ask her some questions. Any other questions, you all?
It's not a question, it's an observation along what you just said. In her writing, she puts forward a pattern or a plan on how to navigate, and how women at that time were able to navigate through their culture and still have an impact. So the openings that were there, she knew how to wedge in and make something of it. And that's a test of an intelligent being.
I think women have been doing that all along. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Thank goodness. Thank you all very much. I just love doing this for you.
Thank you, Jane. We just love it when you come, and it was a wonderful review. We appreciate it.